Good evening, everyone. Really good to be able to share with you guys tonight. We've loved being back in Newcastle. We're just over in Perth for a few months, and just got back a few weeks ago. And it's really good to be back here, and just love this community and the inclusiveness and welcome and love that you get in this sort of an environment. There's not many places like YWAM Newcastle on the planet. There should be more, but it's a really special place with special people, and we're just really privileged to be part of this community, and it's really good. And we had a bit of an interesting adventure coming here this time, and many of you know our story, but out of that sort of story, God's given me our message for tonight. So as we were coming to move back over here from Perth, we had a very, very early morning flight because it was cheap. And we were up very early packing our van. And as we were packing it up, I suddenly see a guy scoot past our van that we're getting all of our bags into. And he's wearing my backpack. And I think, hang on, that's my bag. And I look in the van and it's gone. And then I look and there's a guy scooting away with my bag on his back. And I say, hey, that's my bag. And I chasing him down the street, and then suddenly I wish that I ran regularly and I was super fit, and that he wasn't on a scooter scooting away, and so I just watched it go. It was gone. I couldn't get it back. And in the meantime, trying to call the police and catch the guy, we ended up missing our flight because we were just getting ready to drive away and stuff. And so we had a very dramatic sort of start to our trip to come back over a couple of weeks ago. And sort of with, like that feeling, if you've ever been stolen from, it's pretty like, oh, you don't like it at all. I mean, it's just stuff, it's all replaceable, but it's still a real pain. And we texted people, including people here, and everybody started praying. We ended up getting on a flight to get here. They put us on the next flight without any fees, which was amazing, and we ended up getting over here. But the other thing that started to happen out of that story is that people heard and started to give. They responded immediately with, hey, we want to help. We want to give. And many of you were people that actually gave to solve that problem as well, which is pretty incredible. And out of that time, what ended up happening is I had my laptop stolen and my bag, and we had cash in there and all that sort of stuff. Well, through the gifts that were given through people here and from Facebook friends and things like this, we actually recovered all of that. But the other thing that not many people knew is the computer that got stolen wasn't fully paid off yet. Oh, I was like, no, it's not paid off. But you know what? God actually provided to pay it off as well and replace everything. And so I was sort of thinking about that story, thinking, wow, that was a bit of stress and a bit of pressure. And the scripture that came into my mind was out of Genesis 50, verse 20, and I've been meditating on that. And I want you to go over to this scripture because this little tiny story, this little drama, little pressure, has led me into meditation, which God's really been speaking to me about much bigger stresses, much bigger things that have been going on besides just missing stuff. And I want to share with you a little bit about that tonight. So Genesis 50, verse 20, comes at the very end of the story of Joseph. And he says to his brothers, says, as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. You meant it against me for evil, but God intended it for good. You intended evil, but God intended good. And from that scripture that I've been meditating on, I've been thinking a lot about the life of Joseph, because, if you've hung around church circles very much, you probably have heard a bit about the story of Joseph. And we're going to talk through a bit of that story tonight and meditate on it a bit, because at the end of his life, Joseph had the conclusion that God intended good in his life, despite everything else that had happened. And the thing is, as I've been thinking about, is that God has good intentions for all of our lives. It wasn't just Joseph. It was your life and my life and all of our lives. God looks at you and he intends nothing but good. But the thing about the way that God intends and the way that God works out that good is that it's not always in the way that we think it is. It doesn't always come in the straightest line, in the straightest path. It's often, I find, in a very crooked and interesting sort of pathway. But God intends good. And people might intend us evil, but God actually intends good out of that. And I want to talk a little bit tonight about how those two things kind of contrast with each other and how God's goodness works through other people's even intentions to cause us harm. Let's just talk about the life of Joseph a little bit. Let's just remember some of this story. We're going to meditate on some of the things. And Joseph is a pretty incredible character. If you remember, his father was Jacob, and he was living with his uncle Laban, and he was a bit of a trickster, and he wanted to marry Rachel, but he got tricked into marrying Leah. And he worked for 14 years for two wives, one of whom he didn't want. And in the middle of that 14-year period, there was rivalry between the two wives, Rachel and Leah, and they got their servants involved. And he ended up with 4 wives, and they were all fighting. And if you read the story in Genesis, it's ridiculous. It's crazy. It's a very dysfunctional family. And Joseph comes at the very end of that 14-year period. You see, Rachel, the favorite wife, has been barren that whole time. And then at the very end of that 14 years, Rachel miraculously becomes pregnant. And Joseph is born. He's the miracle child of the favorite wife. And about 6 years later, they pack up and they move back to Canaan. Rachel is again pregnant, this time with Benjamin, but she dies along the way. And so here we have Joseph as a 6-year-old boy moving back, the son of the favorite wife, and his mother who's just passed away. And he's got his only full-blooded sibling, which is Benjamin, who's just a little baby. And he's growing up with 10 older brothers, half-brothers, and at least one older sister. And we don't know much more about Joseph until he's 17 years old. 11 years later, we meet him as the favorite son now, and a dreamer. And because of that favoritism that Jacob showed, his brothers ended up hating him. Now that jealousy and that rivalry runs right through that patriarchal family there in Genesis. Abraham had favorites, and Isaac and Rebekah had favorites, and Jacob and Esau fought, and it takes on sort of enormous proportions in this family. And so Joseph, as a 17-year-old, has these dreams that his brothers and his mother and his father are going to be bowing down to him. And of course, he just shares it like, hey, I had this dream, and it's going to be awesome, and I know you hate me, but you're really going to hate me after this dream. And 3 times there in Genesis 37, it says that they hated him. They hated him because his father treated him as a favorite, but they hated him because of these dreams that he had, and they were jealous. And that jealousy was pretty bad. We know the story that one day he's out looking for his brothers to find out how they are, and they are so angry, so, I don't know, probably hurt by their father's favoritism that they decide, we're going to kill this kid. We're going to be done with him once and for all. But I want you to put yourself for a moment into the story of Joseph, because we can read these stories or see them in Sunday school or watch the cartoons or the VeggieTales versions or whatever you did. But I want you to put yourself into the story of Joseph, because what we discover is the way that he responded is pretty incredible. I want you to think, he's had these dreams, and how was he expecting them to be fulfilled? What do you think was in his mind as a 17-year-old that one day my family is going to bow down to me and I'm going to be sort of the ruler, I'm going to be the guy? I wonder what he thought was going to be the fulfillment of that dream. How was that working out in his 17-year-old mind that that's going to work out in the future? He had no idea what was coming in his life. He had no idea how that dream was going to be fulfilled, did he? No idea what was coming. And as he's looking for his brothers, he's gone on this epic journey up north of the camp, and he finds his brothers near Dothan, and they conspire against him. And I want you to imagine what it would have been like to come to some of these brothers that are maybe a little bit upset, but they grab him and they rip his coat off, and they throw him in a pit. What are you thinking at that moment? You're in a pit. And I wonder if he could hear his brothers talking. I wonder if he could hear his brother Judah saying, let's not kill him. Let's sell him into slavery. Then at least we'll make some money off and be done with him. I mean, he's a brother after all. I wonder if he could hear that conversation. What do you think was going on when they pulled him out of that pit and he suddenly realizes, they're going to sell me. They're selling me into slavery. Later on in the story, his brothers recall how Joseph begged and pleaded, and he was distressed, and they ignored him. What would it have been like to be drug away, perhaps in chains, with that Ishmaelite caravan on the way to Egypt? You see, they lived in southern Judah, and the slave trade was rife, and they knew about that. And so what was going on in his mind? What terror, what horror was going on in his mind as he realized, no, wait, was he shouting? What was going on? That's a long journey to Egypt. It's about 400 kilometers walking. That's a long trip. I mean, that's like from here to Coffs Harbour. That's a long walk. Do you know what I mean? Like for the Americans, it's like New York to Washington, D.C. walking. That's like London to Paris if you could walk across. I suppose you could walk in the tunnel if you wanted to, but it's a long walk. What is going on in his mind as he's walking to Egypt? Imagine Joseph, imagine yourself in his shoes at the slave markets there in Egypt. And he's purchased by Potiphar, and he finds himself in an Egyptian household. He doesn't speak the language, and he's a servant, and there's no way out. And within a very short space of time, probably within a month or two, he finds himself as a slave. Everything's changed. What about your dreams, Joseph? What about your dreams? What's going on? Well, we're not really told what's going on internally. We don't get a lot about what his feelings or his emotions were like. We've got to use our imagination to try to figure that out. But you know what? Somewhere along the journey, Joseph made an incredible decision. It might have been on that long walk. It might have been in Egypt. It might have been once he finally got into Potiphar's house. But the next time we find Joseph in Genesis 39, he's rising to a successful position in Potiphar's house. The Lord was with him, it says, several times in Genesis 39. The Lord was with him, and he rose and became successful in Potiphar's house. When did he make that decision to be excellent in what he did? I mean, think about yourself. Let's think about myself. I'm thinking about myself. That is a hard call. I don't think I would have been serving my little heart out in Potiphar's house. I think I would have been doing the least amount of work possible and thinking I deserve so much better than this, and I'm so hard treated, and something's got to go on to, get me out of the situation. But all we know about Joseph is that he rose into success. It says over and over in Genesis 39, and the Lord was with him. What do you think that witness felt like for Joseph, though? See, the narrator of the story says, and the Lord was with him and caused him to be successful. But in the middle of that story, I bet that witness didn't feel very, very powerful. Yeah, I bet there wasn't this amazing quiet times that Joseph was having. What there was there was hardcore decisions to be excellent in a very difficult situation. And God was with him, and he rose into a position of prominence within that house. Joseph made some incredibly difficult choices. You know what? We're thinking about God's good intentions over Joseph's life, but I really think that the way that those things worked out in his life was through his decision making. I think he partnered with God, probably unknowingly, to bring about God's good intentions in his life because he made very hard decisions to be excellent under difficult circumstances. It might have just been a one-off occasion. I thought, maybe he just made the one-off choice to be excellent. But when he was unjustly thrown into prison, the very next sentence, he rises to a position of prominence in prison. He does it again. Now, I would have totally given up. I don't know about you, but I would have given up. There I am rotting in an Egyptian prison unjustly. I've been sold into slavery by my family. I've not given in to temptation with this woman, and I'm unjustly accused. I cannot defend myself. Now I'm rotting away in a prison. What are you going to do in that situation? Have an incredibly huge pity party and invite yourself to it, right? That's what you're going to do. You're going to sit there and sulk. You're going to complain. You're going to whinge. What are you going to do? He decides to serve. Who is this kid? What is going on in his mind that he makes the decision, I'm going to serve the other prisoners? And we don't know those internal decisions. We just see the results that he rises to influence and responsibility in the prison so that just like in Potiphar's house, the jailer no longer has to worry about anything because Joseph is so faithful with what he's given when no one is watching. He chose incredible sacrificial excellence. Whoa, that's intense. That really challenges me. What do you like when things go hard? I tend to just drop my effort a little bit and think, things have been a bit rough, so I've got an excuse. I don't have to give as much. It's been hard, I can just slack off. I just need a break. I just need to catch my breath a little bit, I can give my best when things are at the best. If I'm at my best, I'll give my best. But if I'm not at my best, I can't possibly be expected to give my best, right? And then you read the story of Joseph, and that excuse is just totally taken away. I hate that. Don't you hate that? But The thing about Joseph is he didn't just choose to be excellent when things were bad. At his worst, he actually kept that up even when things were successful in his life. Think about how suddenly things turned around. One day he was in prison. And he'd had hopes that that cupbearer would get him out of prison, and it was a full 2 years since then. It had been 13 years in prison. 13 years since he was sold into slavery. We don't know how long he was in prison, at least 2 years, probably more. We don't know how long he was in Potiphar's house. But the whole thing took 13 years. That is a long stretch of faithfulness. Do you know what I mean? Like, man, I've been going hard for a week. 13 years, whoa. And then everything changes in a day. You probably know the story about how he interprets the dream of Pharaoh, and suddenly he rises to a position of prominence within the entire nation of Egypt, and he's put in charge. Now, you might sort of be in that situation and think, finally, I've got some respect, I've got position, I've got power. Now I can just take a little break, enjoy the comfort, enjoy the luxury. I've been in prison after all. I deserve it. I was sold into slavery by my family. He doesn't do that. He immediately starts working for the good of the nation and storing up their plenty for their time of need. Who is this guy? 13 years in that hardcore thing. Even when he was in Potiphar's house, when he rose into the position of the chief servant, that was probably a position that was somewhat comfortable in that society. He probably had some level of comfort, some level of freedom. And yet he does not use that freedom for his own advantage. No one would have known if he had given in to Potiphar's wife. No one would have known. Don't you think he kind of deserved some sort of pleasure after all he'd been through? And yet what's his response? I cannot sin against God. But hasn't God forgotten you completely, Joseph? What about your dreams, Joseph? No. Who is this guy? Joseph just didn't give his best at his worst, but he gave his best when things went well. As you come along the story, one of the things that's the most remarkable in meditating about Joseph is his choice to forgive. Many of us have been harmed. We've had stuff done against us. Probably very few of us have had the story of Joseph, but some of you probably had some pretty bad things done to you through time. But hardly any of us ever get the possibility to be in a position of revenge. And yet Joseph had that position. He was in a position where he could have gotten revenge, and he did not take it. Whoa, that's pretty intense. For those 7 years of plenty, he gets married, he has 2 kids, things are going pretty well. I wonder if he ever thought about his family back in Canaan. I wonder if he thought about his little brother Benjamin, who was 11 years old the last time he saw him. I wonder if he wondered about his father. I wonder if he thought, maybe I can slip away for a bit of a holiday up to the old home. I wonder, when did he choose to forgive? When did those things start to happen? We don't know that, but 8 or 9 years after he gets out of prison, suddenly his brothers rock up in Egypt to buy grain. Suddenly there they are. It's been 21, maybe 22 years since they sold him into slavery. He's 38 or 39 years old now. He's married with kids. He's successful. He's the second in command of all of Egypt. And suddenly, blast from the past, there's his brothers. And he recognizes them, and they don't recognize him. And it says there in some part, in chapter 42 of Genesis, that they bowed down to the ground, and he remembered his dreams. And suddenly he's looking at that, and he says, that was the dream. Now, what would that have done to his emotions? Maybe he'd forgotten completely about that. It was 20 years earlier. He probably said, well, I was a young teenager. I ate pizza. I don't know. That was not a real dream. It wasn't for real. I've got a totally different life. I've got to forget all about that. And suddenly, out of nowhere, that morning, he probably didn't wake up thinking, this is the day that my life is going to connect in a very strange way. But suddenly, he's watching his brothers bow down. What is going on in his mind at that moment when suddenly what God said to him 21 years earlier is happening? I wonder if that was the moment when he started to come to the conclusion that you meant evil, but God intended good. Somehow or another, God's intentions have been working in my life for the last 2 decades to bring this point. How did that just happen? Well, I don't know if he'd already chosen to forgive. He certainly tests his brothers. He asked them about his younger brother Benjamin. He's probably wondering, what did they do to him? We're the only two sons of that favorite wife. They sold me into slavery. Maybe they killed him. Do you have any other brothers? They don't know it's him yet. And they find out he does, and he says, okay, bring him back, and I'll know that you're not lying. And he binds up Simeon, and he's probably thinking, what do I do? What do I do? How do I walk this out? And they come back months later, and there is his younger brother Benjamin, and he's alive. And he tests them again by setting up Benjamin. And when they come back, he says, I'm going to put Benjamin in prison. And you know who stands up and says, no, take me. Let him go. Take me. It's Judah. It was the one who suggested selling him into slavery. In those 20 years, something had changed, and Judah says, no. Take me. Don't let any harm come to that kid. We don't know the intervening story of Judah, but something had changed, and Joseph suddenly realizes they've changed. Something happens, and he weeps, and the whole thing comes together. That would have been a very awkward family conversation when his dad arrived and said, you did what? But later on in the story, years and years later, Jacob has died. And everything has kind of worked out. And they've gotten it all, the bad feelings out, and the bad blood is cleared, and they've seen the intentions of God. And here in Genesis 50, verse 15, it says, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, it may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him. So they sent a message to Joseph saying, your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin because they did evil to you. They're such liars. I really don't think he sent that message, but they're like, we've got to do something. And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. Look what happens. Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, behold, we are your servants. But Joseph said, don't fear. Am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil, but God intended it for good. I'll take care of you. See, he's looking back over his life and said, somehow or another, God has intended good in my life. You meant evil. But underneath your purpose, there was a deeper purpose working. I don't know how that works. That makes me ask so many questions. I don't think God intended for his brothers to do evil. That's not what it said. But it says, though people intended evil, God always intended good. He says, I can work that around to make good in your life. And he makes an incredibly intense decision to forgive. As I sort of meditate on those difficult choices that Joseph made, to be excellent in the good and the bad, and to forgive, forgive when he had the possibility of revenge. I mean, you can forgive when you know you'll never get revenge, right? Okay, I give up. But he had it. He could have killed him. Nobody would have questioned that. He could do what he liked. Second in command of the most powerful nation on earth. He had all the power behind him to get revenge on his brothers. He could have left him in prison for 13 years and then killed him. But he didn't. See, what underlines that to me is Joseph had an incredible view of God. Now, I don't know when he came to that conclusion that God is intending good in my life. It might have only been at the end, but there was something about that truth boiling away inside of him the entire time that allowed him to make an excellent decision, that it doesn't matter what's happened to me, I can choose to be an excellent person. I wish I had a better word than excellence, because it's so much more than that, isn't it? When he had an opportunity to sin when nobody would notice, to have a little illicit pleasure on the side, he says, no, I can't sin against God, because when no one's looking, God is watching. When it came time to forgive, he says, look, I'm not in the position of God. God can do what he likes. As for me, I'll do good to you. He feared God intensely. What a challenge for us. His view of God allowed him to look squarely in the face of his brother's evil and said, you intended evil against me. But somehow or another, God has intended good in my life. And he's worked it out despite your best efforts. And I want to commend to us that view tonight. Because it's that view of God, God's good intentions working through our life, that allows the evil that happens to us. Sometimes it's really people intending evil, you know? Sometimes it's just our own mistakes. Sometimes it's no one's fault. It's just accidents that happen in our life. But it allows God to come in and transform that. Now, I think it would make it really difficult for God to have worked that intention out in Joseph's life if he had been a complainer. If he had sit in self-pity and sulked in prison, he probably would have rotted in prison to the end of his life. But he didn't choose to be that type of person. I mean, how would God have accomplished his purposes in Joseph if he'd just given up? Do you know what I mean? I don't know what God would have done, but I think it would have been a totally different story, and we may not have had that story. I was trying to find examples of stories that were the opposite of Joseph, and I really couldn't find me in the Bibles because I suddenly realized probably because they're never written about, because nothing happened. Because they gave up. Do you know what I mean? So I want to challenge us tonight. I want to challenge you to meditate on the story of Joseph. And there's a couple ways I want us to process this tonight. One of the things we need to do is we need to align our lives with God's good intentions for our lives while we're in the middle of the journey. Many of you are young, and we don't have the full story yet. And we're somewhere in the middle of our journey when we don't have the conclusion of what God's intending with our lives. We only have the bits and pieces. We may have dreams, we might have had stuff, good and bad, happen to us, but it's very difficult for many of us in this room who are young to be able to look at the totality of our lives and say, God intended good out of this situation. We don't know yet. We haven't seen the end of it. We're in the middle of it. We don't know. You know, it's very rare that you get situations like that story that I told you that was just a quick fix. You know, my backpack was stolen, people responded in generosity, and God used that to bless above and beyond where I would have been had that not gotten stolen. It was just the goodness of God, and it was just a very quick little example that showed me, wow, God's intending good even when that guy was intending evil against me. And it gives me hope for other things that I don't have time to go into that are going on in our lives where we're in a long journey where we don't yet see the end of the journey. We don't know the end of the story of that, but I can look at that and say, well, I know that God intends good. There's difficulty going on, and there's evil going on, and there's things that I don't understand, and I don't have the end of the story yet, but I know that God is working good in my life. I don't know how that's going to go. I don't know the twists and the turns that are coming, but I know that if I can make some decisions like Joseph, that he will work it out. He'll make it happen. Where do you need to align your life with God's good intentions? Have you been walking in self-pity? I have. Have you been walking in a lack of excellence, giving up on stuff, slacking off a little bit because you deserve to, because it's been tough? Do you know what I mean? I have. Where do we need to sort of align our lives and say, well, hey, it doesn't actually matter what's happened. I mean, it does. But I can't do stuff about that. What I can do is look at what I can do. Where do we need to align our lives? Whatever has happened, God is intending good over your life. You just haven't been alive long enough to see the end of the story, right? Maybe we need to be challenged like Joseph's responses. I don't know how you can study Joseph's life without feeling just soundly rebuked. Do you know what I mean? You just look at this guy and think, there goes all of my best excuses. Have you allowed difficulties to change the way that you've gone about what you're doing? We can all do well for a little while, but when things get a little bit tough, what happens? What do you do? What's been your pattern? Do you want to change that? I've been really challenged by that, meditating on Joseph. Have you used stuff in your life as an excuse to be half-hearted or to give up or to walk in self-pity? Like I've said, I don't think that God's good intentions can get worked out in our lives when we've got those kind of attitudes bubbling under the surface. It kind of blocks stuff going on. It's through excellence in trials, excellence in the good times. And you know what? Deep levels of forgiveness. And so I want you to just pause and think, where does this story impact you? And there's a couple different areas that I've mentioned. It could be that you really need to align your view of your life with the good intentions of God, even though you don't yet see the outcome. It could be that you've got some levels of forgiveness you need to walk in. It could be little things, it could be big things. Could be that you've got to step it up a little bit in this area of excellence. It's really interesting. There's been a number of words throughout these last 2 weeks here in YWAM Newcastle that God's been speaking to us about faithfulness in the little things. And God gave me this word before that. It's like, wow, God is really trying to get us our attention on some of these things here. Drop your excuses and put your best game face on all the time. Because that's what allows God's good intentions to really get worked out in our lives. I mean, He'll work with us no matter what, right? But what I want you to do is I want you to stand up because you've been sitting for a while. Maybe John and the worship team can come back up. I just want to have a moment where we pause
and respond to what God has been challenging you on.